Hello and welcome back to Writing with Righty. This is part 4 of our exploration of the play DNA by Dennis Kelly. We're going to be looking at character and relationships. We are learning to describe the relationships that exist between the characters. And what I'm looking for is how you respond critically to the ways in which the characters interact, use language, and explore ideas. Perhaps one of the most striking features of the play is the way in which Kelly uses structure to frame the relationships between the characters. If we examine the acts and the sections of scenes within them, we see a pattern emerging which serves to enforce relationships. I use the term scene, even though Kelly himself does not refer to the sections within each act as scenes. I want you to consider the following. Act 1. Scene 1. Jan and Mark on the street. Scene 2. Leah and Phil in a field. Scene 3. Lou, John Tate and Danny in a wood. Richard, Cathy and Brian enter later. Scene 4. Leah and Phil in a field. Act 2. Scene 1. Jan and Mark on a street. Scene 2. Leah and Phil in a field. Scene 3. Phil, Leah, Lou and Danny in a wood. Cathy and Richard enter later. Scene 4. Leah and Phil in a field. Act 3. Scene 1. Jan and Mark on a street. Scene 2. Phil and Leah in a field. Jan and Mark enter later. Scene 3. Cathy, Brian, Phil, Leah, Mark, Lou and Jan in a wood. Adam is introduced. Scene 4. Leah and Phil in a field. Act 4. Scene 1. Jan and Mark in the street. Scene 2. Richard and Phil in a field. Writers such as Amy Tanner in her novel The Joy Luck Club have used structure to explore complex relationships between characters. In the case of the Joy Luck Club, each character telling their own or their children's stories. In DNA, the repetition of places and their associated characters, noticeably the pairing such as Leah and Phil, helps reinforce the audience's expectations and helps them to follow the action. But more than that, it shows how the characters change and develop. The fact that characters are substituted, such as Richard for Leah, or made absent, only reinforces the plot because the audience, having experienced the repetitive cycle, will expect to see familiar characters. When characters do not appear as expected, the meaning behind why this is so much more profound. Placing characters in specific locations, such as fields or woods, suggests that Kelly is perhaps drawing on the theory of proxemics. Proxemics is the study of how people use the space which surrounds them, and is one of the many tools through which anthropologists look at people and social groupings. Think about why Kelly uses the woods, street and field. Why not a bedroom or a classroom? Indeed, Kelly is not concerned about the gender or names of his characters, but he is specific about settings. As previously mentioned, it seems that it is important for the audience to relate locations with certain characters, and it is important for us to view those characters in those locations. Does a field offer isolation, whereas a wood provides concealment? And does this emphasize the fact that the darker aspects of the plot are hatched there? Is the street a means of getting from one place to another? And is it true that Jan and Mark are the characters who introduce some of the most significant aspects of the plot, and thus provide us a route into the drama? It is also worth thinking about the musical analogy that I introduced in part 2. I mentioned sonata form, which typically has the following structure: A, B, A. where A is the opening theme, B is a development of the ideas, and then A return back to the original theme. However, composers often develop this idea, creating more complex structures, so an original theme might develop further and therefore might be called A1, and so on. And the piece might end with a concluding finale or coda. In this sense, DNA follows the following structure: A, B, C, B, which is Act 1. A, B, C, 1, B, which is Act 2. A, B, C, 2, B, which is Act 3. A, B, 2, or coda, which is the final act. When we view the play in this way, which parts of the play show the most change in development? And why do you think this is important? Let's now think about the characters in more detail. The pairings are of particular interest. Remember that Kelly instructs us to practically ignore the gender or even ethnicity of the characters, so we are obliged to focus more on the language and the relationship between the characters. This is very important because the inequality between Phil and Leah cannot be understood in terms of one gender dominating another. In other words, the characters of Phil and Leah could be two young men or two young women, a young woman and a young man, or a young man and a young woman. The opening dialogue in Act 1 between Mark and Jan is comical, even though the subject matter is very dark. This is black comedy, if you like. The repetition of the adjective dead forms a comical patter. Consider Jan when she says, "Like dead, dead." The manner in which Jan speaks suggests that she is naive, but as we find out elsewhere in the play, there isn't any rivalry or superiority between Jan and Mark. They are almost one, in a kind of symbiotic relationship, where one is entirely dependent on the other, even in completing each other's sentences. The dark humour of the play is perhaps there to help the audience deal with the actual subject matter, which, as has already been stated, is incredibly dark. A boy is tortured and left for dead. An innocent man is framed for his murder, and then the boy is killed in a brutal manner. This is not a light matter, but the audience is not in the theatre for a news story or an autopsy. They are there to be entertained, and so the tradition, which we find goes all the way back to the court jester counselling his mistress or master in jest, continues. The tradition of satire is found throughout literature, and is even found in newspapers, in cartoons. These cartoons often convey the starkest commentary on serious matters in a light-hearted way. Arguably, the comic language and apparent naivety of some of the characters is there only to provide some kind of relief from the darker message that Kelly is conveying. The choice of location for Leah and Phil, the frustrated lovers if you like, is interesting. A field. A lot is going off between these two. Leah says, "Are you thinking about me? What good things, Phil, or..." And she also says, "We've got each other. We need each other." So this suggests that there is a closeness between the two, but there is also so much tension and a major play on power dynamics. Phil is always eating whilst the other characters are not. Phil only speaks to the gang, but never replies to Leah when they are alone. His silence speaks loudest, and it speaks of power and control. By not verbally acknowledging what Leah says, she's left to talk to herself, to form her own internal monologue, which without comment from Phil is left unacknowledged. If a basic need of a person is to be recognised, then Phil clearly denies Leah this need. Ironically, when Phil does finally offer Leah some physical comfort, her character has moved on, and she literally walks away. John Tate, unlike Phil, is a character who needs to express himself verbally, even if he can also enforce his will through violent action if he needs to. He says, "Look, haven't I looked after things before?" And, "Lou, are you scared of anyone?" John Tate uses coercion to maintain control. Anyone prepared to challenge him are quickly put down, as is demonstrated by how he deals with Richard. But behind John's bravado is a more timid character. We learn later that John leaves the gang and finds religion, as well as becoming disturbed by the events of the play. Significantly, he feels it necessary to ban the word dead, as if it is something that he can never come to terms with. Cathy and Brian are useful characters for comparison. When they first enter together, they epitomise the image we often associate with theatre itself. The masquerade masks showing a happy and sad face. This might be accidental, but nevertheless, it illustrates the pathos of the situation and how these characters are affected. One with intense sadistic pleasure, and the other a complete nervous breakdown that later requires medication. It is important to consider that at this point, the audience is not privy to the circumstances or manner of Adam's death. However, the fact that Cathy and Brian express such naked but equally contrasting emotions causes us to judge them, which perhaps says more about us than it does them. To return back to John Tate for a moment, it is in this scene where John asserts his authority, placing pressure on Brian and comparing him to a piece of filth. Consider how this foreshadows the condition in which we later find Adam, filthy and eating filth. Curiously, when Leah approaches John, he treats her with apparent contempt. But rather than seemingly ignoring her with silence like Phil does, he instead physically silences her by putting his finger on her lips. John has no right to do this. Although subtle, he is invading Leah's personal space in a form of what can only be considered an assault. Despite his bravado and professed ability to look after things, it is Phil, not John, who comes up with a plan to save the gang. The play on the Coke can is as powerful as it is innocuous. The Bonobos Soliloquy. Amongst Leah's many monologues, arguably her speech about the bonobos is the most profound. Kelly introduces a dose of dramatic irony here, as Leah asserts that if we discovered bonobos before chimps, our understanding of each other would be very different. This is profound, as Leah instructs us that chimps are violent and prone to isolate their fellow creatures, whereas bonobos are communal creatures obsessed with mutual support, as well as having a penchant for experimental sex. Clearly, the irony of her situation is lost on her, as she and her friends have clearly demonstrated that their behaviour is much more akin to that of chimps than it is of bonobos. This could be looked at in a different light, however. It could equally be argued that Leah is reflecting here on her own condition, that she is holding up the bonobos as an example to aspire to. Think about how the characters change and develop as the play progresses, in particular how John Tate is replaced by Phil, and how the relationship between Phil and Leah changes. You might also want to compare Leah's character with that of Cathy, and how in a way, Leah does take on the role of a bonobo, and Cathy a chimp. In Act 4, we also witness how Phil begins to assert his power and influence through the threat of physical retribution against Brian, and how ultimately he sanctions the murder of Adam. Interestingly, it is not Phil who carries out the murder, but Cathy. Cathy goes on to take the role of de facto leader of the gang, behaving like John Tate at school by bullying students, as Phil retires to his field of contemplation, where Leah is replaced by Richard. Perhaps then, it is by the events in the play that the strands of DNA are changed or replaced, but the structures remain broadly the same. We as human beings have the capacity to grow and to change, to even walk away. But some forces remain constant, and conspire to maintain the status quo. Thank you for watching. I really hope that this series has been useful in helping you to broaden your understanding of the play DNA by Dennis Kelly. And I wish you all the best in your examination.